Proposed by philosopher Robert Nozick, the utility monster is a thought experiment that attempts to show that utilitarianism could justify, or even morally require, harming and destroying all living things, with the exception of the utility monster, of course. The utility monster is special since it is a being who is capable of experiencing and receiving more pleasure than any other being, and it is not subject to diminishing returns. Regardless of what's generating pleasure, a human or any other living thing would only receive a fraction of the pleasure that could be experienced by the utility monster. So if we ought to maximize happiness, as the classical utilitarian would argue, then we ought to allocate all pleasure-generating resources to the utility monster. After all, the pleasure the utility monster generates will vastly outweigh the pleasure we would generate from the same resources. Unfortunately, this leaves us deprived of anything that gives us pleasure. So what are some moves that the utilitarian could take in order to avoid the problems posed by the utility monster? Well, I'll go over a few responses. The first response I'll address is a common reaction to the problem, which is that the utility monster is too contrived, and even if it does pose a problem, it's too detached to be taken seriously. The second response brings up other forms of utilitarianism. The third is to simply bite the bullet, and the last response involves making the greatest happiness principle more precise. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list of responses to the utility monster, but with the exception of the last one, they are fairly common, and they are all worth consideration. The first response isn't satisfactory, since it fails to even address the problem. Clearly, the utility monster, as conceived by the thought experiment, doesn't really exist. That's why it's called a thought experiment. However, the utility monster still poses at least two problems worth considering before being quickly dismissed. First, it challenges a very important principle of utilitarianism, and a good thought experiment in ethics should make us think critically about moral principles. If the greatest happiness principle could justify, or even morally require, the destruction of all living things, then there appears to be a problem with the principle, and this problem deserves some attention. However, one could bite the bullet on this point and see no problem with sacrificing everyone to the utility monster. I'll address that later. Second, while there are no utility monsters like the one in the thought experiment, there are, in a weaker sense, utility monsters that we actually do encounter. It would be strange to call impoverished children utility monsters, but that aside, there are many powerful utilitarian arguments that support allocating resources to impoverished children, and these arguments use the same reasoning that's found in the utility monster thought experiment. Some examples of similar arguments can be found in Peter Singer's The Life You Can Save. If you're a fairly well-off citizen of a developed country, then you probably have some money to spend as you please. While it's true that going out and spending some money on entertainment for yourself will create some happiness, it's also true that the same amount of money could be spent on food, life-saving vaccinations, mosquito nets, or clean drinking water for those who are not as well off. And it's definitely plausible that saving multiple lives with the previously mentioned supplies would generate more pleasure and less pain than simply treating yourself. At this point, the utilitarian could easily say that, in this case of allocating resources, no one dies or really suffers, whereas in the utility monster case, a lot of people do. So their point still stands. The greatest happiness principle does well with important real-world cases and only runs into problems when applied in unrealistic circumstances. And that's fair to a point, but it's not true, since there are real-life cases where the greatest happiness principle doesn't do so well. An example of this would be the leak of celebrity photos back in 2014, in which hackers gained access to the private photos of celebrities and then went on to make them public. Obviously, this breach of privacy caused, and will continue to cause, a lot of distress for the victims. But divulging these photos also created a lot of happiness, albeit for pretty deplorable reasons. However, under utilitarianism, happiness is happiness, and a morally correct action is one that maximizes happiness. The photos being made public, with or without anyone's consent, creates more happiness than if the photos remained private. Under these circumstances, it seems a utilitarian is committed to saying that the hackers' actions were morally permissible.
Well, check this out over here. We got some, I think these are Scientologists. I'm not sure. Maybe we should go ask. Hey, you guys are Scientologists, huh?
No,
That's pretty cool.
The second response, much like the first, also fails to address the utility monster. The utility monster is a problem for ethical theories that hold happiness to be the only thing with intrinsic worth, which clearly applies to classical utilitarianism. But I do think it's fair to clarify that the problem does not pose a problem for every form of utilitarianism. However, this move should not be used to dismiss the challenges the utility monster poses for classical utilitarianism, especially if one happens to be a classical utilitarian. The third response is to simply bite the bullet. Some utilitarians will say that the utility monster, even if we do accept that it would permit or require sacrificing everyone, does not show classical utilitarianism to be objectionable. And if we do find mass sacrifice objectionable, it's more due to a visceral reaction rather than anything to do with a reasonable response. While this could be the case for many people, it's not necessarily the case for everyone who finds the utility monster to be a problem for classical utilitarianism. For example, Nozick believed that people should not be treated merely as means, but instead as ends in themselves, which is an idea that can be traced back to Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative. This is a conflict of moral principles that the utility monster really brings to light. Again, under classical utilitarianism, the only end is happiness. This means that people are, and can be used, as means to this end. In other words, when push comes to shove, we are disposable if it maximizes happiness. On the face of it, this is a large drawback of utilitarianism, but when faced with certain moral dilemmas, this also becomes a strength of utilitarianism. There are no shortages of thought experiments or real-life cases where some people must die in order to save a greater number of people, and utilitarianism can easily justify these sacrifices with the greatest happiness principle. But it also serves as a weakness when, for example, it condones killing an innocent person to calm an angry mob, or killing a healthy drifter to save multiple dying patients. The last response involves making the greatest happiness principle more precise. At the start of this video, the problem was illustrated as a conflict between the utility monster and the greatest happiness principle, which was roughly defined as the idea that we ought to maximize happiness. However, one could take issue with this variation of the greatest happiness principle. Many utilitarians would say that the greatest happiness principle is not merely about maximizing happiness, but instead it is that we ought to maximize happiness for the most people, or the greatest numbers. So while the utility monster will generate the most happiness, it fails to do so for the most people. With this revamped version of the greatest happiness principle, the utilitarian can avoid feeding everyone to the utility monster. However, it's not clear whether this expanded upon principle actually resolves the problems we're faced with. Besides the utility monster, there are cases where using the same resources on fewer people will generate more happiness than helping more people. And in these cases, helping the few over the many seems like the right thing to do, especially if happiness is the only end. In his book, Moral Philosophy, philosopher D.D. Raphael illustrates this problem and gives an example where it's not entirely clear what one ought to do according to this principle. Taken from page 47, here's an extensive quote from Raphael's Moral Philosophy, which will close out this video. Utilitarianism claims to provide one underlying principle to be used as a criterion in resolving conflicts. But does utilitarianism really give us a single principle? It tells us that the right action is that which produces the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers. The criterion has two components. It urges us to produce as much happiness as possible and to distribute it as widely as possible. There are two principles here, not one, and they can conflict. Suppose that I have 20 pounds to give away. Should I give 10 pounds to each of 2 old age pensioners, perhaps enabling each of them to buy a cardigan, which will help to keep them warm over the winter? Or should I give 10p to each of 200 pensioners, enabling each of them to do something like buying a cup of tea? It seems to me that the results of the first action add up to a greater total of happiness produced. But of course, only 2 people are affected, as against the 200 who would be benefited by the second action. Which of the alternatives am I supposed to choose if I use the principle of utility as my guide? The so-called principle of utility, or greatest happiness principle, is in fact a principle of utility plus a principle of justice. It is a principle of aggregation plus a principle of distribution. The second part of it adopts an egalitarian concept of justice. In Bentham's words, everybody to count for one, nobody for more than one. The most difficult moral conflicts, especially in social life, are conflicts between utility and justice.